Richard Sterling grabbed his wife's face with one hand, his fingers pressing into her cheeks hard enough to leave marks, and smiled. "You are nothing," he said. "You have always been nothing. Without me, you don't exist." Victoria did not flinch. She did not cry. She simply looked at him with eyes that held something he could not read, something patient and cold and absolutely certain. He laughed, straightened his tie, picked up his overnight bag, and walked out the door to meet his mistress at the most exclusive hotel in New York City. What Richard Sterling did not know was that his wife owned every single room in that building. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button and follow this story all the way to the end. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Richard Sterling had not always been a man who lied with elegance. There was a time early in his career when he would sweat through his collar before a board meeting, when his hands would tremble before a cold call, when the world of high finance felt like a room he had snuck into without an invitation. That Richard Sterling, the one from a middle-class neighborhood in Westchester, the one who wore the same interview suit 3 years in a row, the one who ate lunch alone at his desk for 2 years straight because he was too proud to admit he couldn't afford the restaurants his colleagues frequented, that version of Richard had long since been buried. The man who stood in the marble lobby of the Grand Elysian Hotel on that particular Friday evening was something else entirely. He was 51 years old, 6'1", silver at the temples, in a way that fashion magazines called distinguished, and his assistant called intimidating. He wore a charcoal Brioni suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and he wore it with the relaxed confidence of a man who had forgotten what it felt like to worry about money. His watch was a Patek Philippe. His shoes were hand-stitched in Florence. His cologne was something rare, something that made people turn their heads in elevators and wonder who had just walked in. He was by every visible measure a man at the absolute peak of his power. And standing beside him, her hand tucked into the crook of his elbow, was Jessica Monroe. Jessica was 29. She worked in the marketing division of Sterling Capital Partners technically. In practice, she had spent the last 11 months learning that proximity to power was its own kind of currency, and that Richard Sterling was very generous when he felt appreciated. She had dark hair that fell past her shoulders, sharp green eyes that knew exactly how to soften at the right moment, and a laugh that she had carefully calibrated to sound spontaneous. She wore a red dress that Richard had paid for, and she carried a small handbag that Richard had also paid for, and she stood in the lobby of the Grand Elysian, with the wide-eyed wonder of a woman who had never stayed anywhere quite like this before. "Richard," she breathed, tilting her head back to look up at the ceiling. "This place is unreal." He didn't look up. He had been here before. Several times, in fact. The Grand Elysian was the kind of hotel that made an impression on first-timers and confirmed something deeper for regulars, the sense that the world had two tiers and you were lucky enough to occupy the higher one. "Wait until you see the suite," he said in the tone of a man who had already decided how the evening would go. The lobby of the Grand Elysian was the kind of space that architects dream about and normal people photograph obsessively before realizing no photograph can capture it. The ceilings soared 4 stories above the marble floors. Enormous arrangements of white flowers, fresh, replaced daily, each one costing more than the flowers stood on pedestals throughout the space. The lighting was warm and deliberate, designed to make every guest look slightly better than they actually were. Soft piano music drifted from somewhere unseen. Everything smelled faintly of jasmine and cedar. And everywhere on the elevator doors, on the subtle embossing of the stationery visible at the front desk, on the small golden plaques near the entrances to the restaurant, and the spa were the same 2 initials. V.D. Richard had seen them before. He had never thought about them. He walked to the front desk with the posture of a man who expected to be recognized. He was. "Mr. Sterling," said the man behind the counter. His name tag read Thomas, and he was exactly the kind of front desk manager that a hotel like this required, polished, warm, professionally invisible. "We've been expecting you. Your suite is ready." "Good," Richard said, placing his hand flat on the counter in the way that powerful men do, not demanding anything, just establishing presence. "I want the champagne chilled before we get upstairs. The Krug, not the house label. And I'll need dinner reservations at Aurelius for 9 o'clock. Table by the window." Thomas did not blink. "Of course, Mr. Sterling. I'll have everything arranged. And complete discretion." Richard's voice dropped half a register. "Just enough." Thomas nodded with the practiced neutrality of a man who had heard that request many times from many men in many expensive suits. "As always, Mr. Sterling," Jessica squeezed his arm as they walked toward the elevator. "You're so good at this," she said. "At what?" he asked, though he already knew. "At being in control of everything." He smiled. It was the kind of smile that belonged to a man who believed that sentence completely. The elevator doors opened. They stepped inside, and the doors closed behind them. Neither of them noticed the two initials engraved on the elevator panel. VD. Richard had booked the presidential suite. Not because he needed the space, he was one man and one woman for 2 nights, but because the presidential suite was what you booked when you wanted to make a statement. When you wanted the woman beside you to understand without words exactly what kind of man you were and exactly what kind of life she was being offered a glimpse of. The suite was extraordinary. 3 bedrooms, a private dining room, a terrace with views of the city skyline, a living room with furniture that had been custom designed for the space. There was a grand piano in the corner that no one ever played. There was a private bar stocked with bottles that Richard actually recognized, which was its own kind of luxury. The bathroom alone was larger than most Manhattan studio apartments. When the door opened and Jessica stepped inside and made a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a laugh, Richard felt the familiar warmth of satisfaction spread through his chest. This was why he did this. Not the affair exactly, or not only the affair. It was the performance of power. The ability to open a door and watch someone's world expand because of your resources, your access, your choices. Richard had grown up watching his father come home tired and diminished from a job that paid just enough to sustain disappointment. He had promised himself at 17 years old, standing in his father's kitchen on a Tuesday night when the heating had gone out and there was nothing in the refrigerator worth eating, that he would never live that way, that he would build something, that he would become someone that rooms responded to. He had done that. He was still doing that. "Come here," he said, and Jessica came to him, and he kissed her in the way that powerful men kiss women they are paying for, with confidence rather than tenderness, with ownership rather than desire. She let him. She was good at letting him. They had champagne on the terrace. The city spread out below them in all its nighttime glory. Millions of lights, millions of people, millions of lives that were smaller and quieter and less consequential than the one Richard Sterling believed himself to be living. "Tell me something," Jessica said, curling her legs beneath her on the outdoor sofa, her champagne glass held loosely in her fingers. "Depends what you want to know," he said. "Does your wife ever wonder about where you are?" He looked at her for a moment. It was a question he did not particularly enjoy, not because it made him feel guilty, it didn't, but because it introduced a complexity into an evening he had designed to be simple. Victoria was not meant to be a presence in this room. She was meant to be in their townhouse in the West Village, managing whatever it was she managed, being exactly as predictable and undemanding as she always was. Victoria. He almost laughed. Victoria is very comfortable with her life exactly the way it is. She doesn't ask questions because she doesn't want to know the answers. Some people are built for comfort. She's one of them. Jessica studied him over the rim of her glass. Something in her expression shifted, not judgment exactly, but calculation. "She sounds lonely," she said. "She sounds practical," he corrected. "There's a difference." He refilled both their glasses and changed the subject, and Jessica let him, because she was smart enough to know which battles were worth having. But later, much later, when Jessica was asleep and Richard sat alone on the terrace with the 3rd glass of champagne turning warm in his hand, he thought about what she'd said. Lonely. He considered Victoria, her quiet mornings, her organized closets, her careful way of moving through their life together without taking up too much space. The way she ran their household with a kind of invisible efficiency that he had always taken for granted. The way she smiled at dinner parties, always said the right thing, always wore the right clothes, always positioned herself exactly where he needed her to be without him ever having to ask. The way she had raised their 2 children, now both in college, with a steadiness and warmth that he had occasionally noticed and never once praised. He thought about all of this. And then he finished his champagne and went to bed, because men like Richard Sterling were not in the habit of thinking too deeply about what their wives might be feeling. He was asleep within minutes. Saturday arrived with the kind of golden morning light that made expensive hotel rooms feel like something out of a magazine. Richard ordered breakfast through the suite's private butler, a quiet, slightly formal man named Edmund, who had a way of appearing and disappearing without being asked, and they ate on the terrace eggs Benedict smoked salmon coffee from a French press fresh pastries arranged on a silver tray. Jessica was in a good mood. She was excited about the hotel, about the view, about the life that seemed to pulse at the edge of her fingertips whenever she was with Richard. "Can we go to the spa today?" she asked. "Already booked," he said. "And dinner at that place? The restaurant downstairs. Aurelius, 9 o'clock, table by the window." She beamed at him. "You really do think of everything." He spread jam on his toast and looked at her the way a man looks at something pleasant that has not yet disappointed him. "That's why things go smoothly," he said. He believed it completely. The morning passed easily. Richard made a few calls he could not entirely disconnect from the market, even on a weekend, while Jessica visited the spa. She came back glowing, filled with stories about the treatments, about the attendants who had wrapped her in warm towels and played soft music, and told her it was one of the finest spa facilities in the country. "Richard, the woman who did my massage, I asked her how long she'd worked here, and she said 15 years. 15 years at the same hotel. Isn't that something?" "Means the management treats people well," he said, scrolling through his phone. She kept mentioning the owner, said the owner had completely transformed the employee culture here, that it used to be one way, and now it's entirely different. More humane, she said. Richard looked up. The owner. She was very complimentary, said they'd never worked for anyone who genuinely cared about the staff the way... Jessica paused. She didn't actually say a name, just the owner. I got the sense it was someone pretty remarkable. Richard shrugged. Probably some silent investor somewhere, he said. These big properties are always owned by holding companies. Nobody really knows who's behind them. Edmund appeared in the doorway of the sitting room, silent as always, arriving without announcement. Mr. Sterling, can I bring you anything before your afternoon arrangements? Yes, Richard said, setting down his phone. Another coffee. And Edmund, who owns this hotel. Do you know, off the top of your head? Edmund's expression did not change, but something in his posture, something very subtle, barely detectable, shifted just slightly. The property is part of the Davenport Hospitality Group, sir, he said. And who's behind that? Edmund paused. Just for a beat, just half a second longer than necessary. The chairwoman, he said carefully, is a private individual. They prefer to maintain a low profile. Fair enough, Richard said, already reaching for his phone again. Edmund disappeared. Jessica was watching him from across the room. Why did you ask? No reason, he said. Just curious. But something tugged at the edge of his mind, something faint and formless that he couldn't quite name. Davenport. The name settled somewhere in the back of his consciousness, like a word you've heard before in a context you can't immediately recall. He pushed it aside. Men like Richard Sterling did not follow feelings. They followed data. By evening, the unease had dissolved entirely, replaced by the confidence that always returned to him when he was surrounded by enough luxury and enough deference. He showered, dressed in the dark navy suit he had packed specifically for this dinner, the one his tailor in London had finished 3 weeks ago, and emerged from the bedroom to find Jessica waiting dressed in something ivory and elegant that made her look several years older in the best way. You look good, he told her. You look powerful, she said. He offered her his arm. Aurelius was the Grand Elysian's crown jewel, a Michelin-starred restaurant on the top floor of the hotel that had been featured in every relevant publication and had a waiting list that stretched months into the future for anyone who didn't have direct connections. The decor was understated in the way that only the most expensive places can afford to be dark wood, warm light tables spaced far enough apart that conversations remained private. Servers who materialized and vanished with choreographed invisibility. Richard had eaten here before. He ordered without looking at the menu, selected a wine without consulting the sommelier, and settled into his chair with the ease of a man who had been born into rooms like this, even though he most certainly had not. To the weekend, Jessica said, lifting her glass. To the weekend, he agreed. They clinked glasses. The wine was exceptional. The food when it arrived was the kind of meal that made people go quiet, not from rudeness, but from the simple, involuntary acknowledgement that something extraordinary was happening on the plate in front of them. Even Richard, who ate well enough that excellent food rarely surprised him anymore, paused at the first bite, and registered something rare, genuine pleasure uncomplicated by anything. The restaurant hummed around them, the murmur of other conversations, the soft clink of cutlery, the occasional quiet instruction from a server to a colleague. It was the perfect evening, or it was for exactly 47 more minutes. Richard was halfway through his entree when he became aware of a change in the room. It was not dramatic. There was no sudden sound, no visible event, but the atmosphere shifted the way a room shifts when a storm is building somewhere beyond the horizon, and your body registers the change in pressure before your mind catches up. He looked up from his plate. His fork paused midway. The servers near the entrance had stilled. A maitre d', who had been moving efficiently between tables, had stopped, was standing with his hands clasped in front of him, his posture altered into something formal and alert. Two men near the door, men in dark suits who had not been there a moment ago, and who did not look like diners, stood with the specific stillness of people who were waiting for something specific. Jessica was still talking about something, her friend's apartment renovation, he thought, but her voice seemed to come from very far away, and then the doors of Aurelius opened. The first person through was a woman who appeared to be carrying a leather portfolio. Behind her came a man in a charcoal suit who had the unmistakable bearing of someone who attended meetings in law offices. Behind him came a woman in her early 40s who Richard had never seen before, tall in a suit of dark burgundy, her hair up her posture extraordinary. And behind them came Victoria. Richard's world did not stop. It did not freeze dramatically the way worlds stop in movies. Instead, it narrowed like a camera slowly tightening its focus, eliminating everything peripheral until there was only her, only the specific and impossibly real image of his wife walking into this restaurant, in this hotel, in this city where he had told her he was not. She was wearing black. A structured black suit that he had never seen before, perfectly fitted, paired with a single strand of pearls that caught the restaurant's warm light. Her hair, which she usually wore loose or in a casual knot when they were at home, was pinned back with a precision that transformed her face into something sharper and more commanding than he had ever seen. She was not the Victoria he knew. And this thought arrived with a cold precision that cut through the champagne and the wine and the satisfaction of the evening. She was exactly Victoria. She was just a version of Victoria that he had never been paying enough attention to see. She did not look around the room with uncertainty. She did not hesitate at the entrance. She walked directly toward his table. Jessica had finally stopped talking. She had followed Richard's gaze and gone absolutely still, her fork suspended over her plate, the color beginning to drain from her face in real time. Richard could not speak, could not move, could not do the thing he would have done in a boardroom: calculate, strategize, find the angle. Every tool that had served him in 30 years of professional combat evaporated completely. Victoria stopped at their table. She looked at Richard first, then at Jessica, then back at Richard. Her expression was calm in the way that deep water is calm, perfectly still on the surface, and containing everything beneath. When she spoke, her voice was level and clear, and carrying in a way that the nearest tables could not help but hear. "Richard," she said, "I believe you are sitting in my seat." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Richard Sterling had ever heard. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Victoria tilted her head slightly with the patience of a woman who had exactly as much time as she needed and was in no hurry at all. "Your seat," he finally managed. "My table," she said. "My restaurant." She paused. "My hotel." The woman with the leather portfolio stepped forward and placed a single document on the table beside Richard's plate. He looked down at it involuntarily. At the top of the page in clean formal print were the words, "Davenport Hospitality Group Certificate of Sole Ownership," and below that, the name, Victoria Eleanor Davenport Sterling. Richard's eyes moved slowly from the page back to his wife's face. "VD," he said almost to himself. And as he said it, the two letters came back to him on the elevator panel, on the plaques, on the hotel stationery, on every surface of the Grand Elysian Hotel that he had walked through for 2 days without once wondering what they meant, because men like Richard Sterling did not question the things that surrounded them. They assumed they belonged there. Victoria held his gaze with absolute steadiness. 118 hotels, she said quietly, across 11 countries. The Davenport Hospitality Group has been in my family for 3 generations. I have been chairwoman for 6 years. She let that settle. This particular property is my favorite." She paused one more beat. "I do hope you enjoyed your stay." Jessica pushed back her chair and stood up too quickly, knocking her wine glass and sending a splash of red across the white tablecloth. I should excuse me. I need—" "Please stay," Victoria said, and her tone was so quiet and so certain that Jessica sat back down without meaning to. "We're just getting started." Richard felt the floor of his understanding give way beneath him. Not the marble floor of the restaurant, the conceptual floor, the one he had been standing on his entire adult life, the one that told him he was the architect of every room he entered, the one that told him power flowed from him outward into the world. The attorney in the charcoal suit opened a second folder. Victoria spoke without looking at him. 37 months, she said. "That's how long I have been documenting this. Not because I was waiting for revenge, Richard. I want to be clear about that. Because when a woman like me makes a decision, she makes it completely. And completely means with evidence, with counsel, with a plan." She finally looked at the attorney. He placed the second document in front of Richard. Divorce papers, already filed. The judge's stamp was dated 4 days ago. Richard looked at them, at his name printed in the space reserved for the respondent, at her signature already in place, neat, decisive, taking exactly the amount of space it needed, and not a single millimeter more. He thought about all the things he could say. He thought about the leverage he believed he had, the prenuptial agreement, the asset structures, the financial complexity that his attorneys had built over years to protect exactly this kind of scenario. And then slowly he reached the edge of that thought and found that it had no floor either. Because the woman sitting across from him had just told him she had been planning this for 37 months. 37 months. He had underestimated her every single day for 37 months. And she had spent every single one of those days building the case that was now sitting on the table in front of him, next to his half-eaten entree in the restaurant that she owned in the hotel. That she owned in the empire that he had never once asked her about because he had never once considered that she had one. "Victoria," he started. "Don't," she said. One word. Completely quiet. Completely final. The restaurant had gone still around them, in the way that a room goes still when everyone present understands that something real is happening, something that is not entertainment, not spectacle, but the actual seismic realignment of a human life. Richard Sterling sat in the chair he had occupied with such certainty 2 hours ago, and felt for the first time since he was 17 years old, standing in his father's dark kitchen, the specific sensation of being in a room that did not belong to him. He had been wrong about so many things, but he had been most wrong about this. He had believed with absolute confidence that he knew his wife. He had not known her at all. The silence at that table lasted exactly 4 seconds. Richard counted them without meaning to, the way you count seconds after lightning before the thunder arrives and confirms the storm is real. 4 seconds of absolute stillness. The restaurant, the servers, Jessica frozen across from him. Victoria, standing with the quiet certainty of a woman who had rehearsed nothing because she needed to rehearse nothing, and then the world crashed back in. Richard Sterling had survived 30 years in finance by never showing his hand, by keeping his face exactly where he wanted it, by controlling the temperature of every room he entered. He had sat across from men who were trying to destroy him and smiled. He had delivered bad news to boards of directors without his voice changing pitch by a single degree. He was by professional reputation unshakable. He was shaking now, not visibly, not in any way that Jessica could see or that the nearby tables could observe. But inside his chest something had come loose, some essential load-bearing structure had shifted, and he could feel the vibration of it in his hands and his jaw behind his eyes. "Victoria," he said again, and this time he heard himself, clearly heard the thing he was trying to suppress leaking through anyway. "We should talk privately." She looked at him with the expression of a woman who has already heard every version of that sentence and found all of them equally inadequate. "We had years to talk privately," she said. "You chose not to." The attorney beside her, the man in the charcoal suit whose name Richard did not yet know but would spend considerable time learning in the weeks ahead, shifted his folder with the practiced patience of a man who had been in many rooms exactly like this one and was comfortable in all of them. Jessica made a sound, not a word exactly, more like the beginning of several words that couldn't decide which one deserved to go first. She looked at Richard with an expression he recognized. It was the look of someone who had just realized the thing they were standing on was not solid ground. "Richard." she said, her voice dropping to something that was almost a whisper. Who is she? The question was so profoundly wrong for the moment that it almost made him laugh. Who is she? As if the certificate sitting on the table next to his plate was not self-explanatory. As if the body language of every single person in this restaurant had not already answered that question completely. Victoria turned to look at Jessica for the first time. Directly. Fully. With the kind of attention that most people spend their whole lives trying to avoid receiving. I'm his wife, Victoria said, and you are terminated effective as of 10 minutes ago from your position at Sterling Capital Partners. She paused one beat. HR has already been notified. Your access cards were deactivated at 8:47 this evening. There's a box of your personal items being prepared as we speak. Jessica's mouth opened. Nothing came out. You can't do that, Richard said, and even as he said it, he heard the fundamental error in it, not legally, not strategically, but simply as a sentence spoken by a man who was only now understanding how little he actually controlled. She can, the attorney said, speaking for the first time. His voice was unhurried and precise in the way of a man who chose every word the way a surgeon chooses instruments. As of 6 days ago, your wife holds a controlling interest in Sterling Capital Partners through a series of acquisitions that your own legal team failed to flag. The details are in tab 4 of the document in front of you. Richard looked down at the folder. He did not open it. He could not open it. Not here, not in front of these people, not in front of the tables nearby where he could feel the weight of witnesses pressing in from every direction. He was a man who needed information before he reacted, and every piece of information arriving right now was a grenade with the pin already pulled. Tab 4, the attorney said again pleasantly, as if he were discussing a lunch order. Richard opened the folder. Tab 4 was 43 pages long. He looked at the first page for approximately 6 seconds. His eyes moved across the text without fully processing it, names of shell companies he didn't recognize. Acquisition dates going back almost 3 years, transaction amounts that made his vision blur slightly, and then he closed it. His hands were very still on the table. How? He said. It wasn't a full question. It was the fragment of something larger that he couldn't yet build into a sentence. Victoria sat down. Across from him in the chair that had been pulled out for her by a server who seemed to appear for exactly this purpose, with the ease of a woman sitting in her own dining room, which technically she was. You want to know how? She said. Yes. She looked at him for a long moment. There was no anger in her face. That was the thing he kept searching for and kept failing to find. He wanted anger, needed it because anger was comprehensible. Anger meant she was reactive, emotional, operating from pain. He could work with that. He could find the edges of anger and use them. What was in her face instead was something that had no edges at all. Richard, she said, you stopped paying attention to me a very long time ago. That's the how. Jessica pushed her chair back. I'll be in the room, she said, directing this at no one in particular, and stood up and walked away from the table in the careful, deliberate way of someone who is trying not to run. Neither Richard nor Victoria watched her go. The Davenport family has been in hospitality for 3 generations, Victoria said, her voice shifting slightly, becoming something more factual, more layered. My grandfather built the first property in 1961. My mother expanded through the 70s and 80s. When she passed, I inherited controlling interest. I was 24 years old. Richard stared at her. You were 24, he said slowly. When we met, she said I was 31. The group had 42 properties. I was already running it. She tilted her head slightly. You never asked what I did before we met. Do you remember that? You told me once that your work was complicated enough without having to follow someone else's career. He remembered saying something like that. He had meant it as a joke, or as something close enough to a joke that he hadn't examined it further. I kept it separate, she continued, from our marriage. Deliberately, because when we were building our life together, I genuinely believed. She paused, just briefly, the first crack in the composure so small he almost missed it. I believed you were someone who would have been proud of it, eventually, when I showed you. The past tense landed like something physical. Victoria, you filed for divorce 2 years ago, she said. He went absolutely still. I beg your pardon. You consulted with a divorce attorney, August 2 years ago. Jeffrey Harmon's firm on Park Avenue. You spent 40 minutes with him discussing what a divorce from me would cost you. She looked at him steadily. You decided the financial exposure was too significant, so you didn't proceed. Richard's jaw tightened. How do you know that? Because I know everything, Richard. She said it without drama, without satisfaction, as a simple statement of fact. I have known about Jessica Monroe since the 4th month of your involvement with her. I have known about the 3 business trips that were not business trips. I have known about the hotel in Boston, the apartment in Chicago, the dinner in San Francisco where you told her you were thinking about making changes in your life. Each sentence hit him differently. Not like blows, like disclosures, like files being opened one by one in front of a jury. I want to be clear about something, Victoria said. I am not here because I am angry. I passed through anger a long time ago. I am here because I am finished. There is a significant difference. The attorney placed a 3rd document on the table. Richard looked at it without touching it. Asset division, the attorney said. Your wife's team has been thorough. Given the nature of the Davenport holdings and their independence from any marital assets, the division is more straightforward than you might expect. However, he opened to a marked page. Your accounts have been frozen pending full disclosure. That action was taken this morning at 9 a.m. Richard's phone was on the table. He picked it up and opened his banking app. The numbers that came back were not the numbers that were supposed to be there. He set the phone face down. You froze my personal accounts, he said. Your joint accounts, Victoria corrected, which under the terms of your marital agreement in New York State are subject to court order pending divorce proceedings. Your personal trading accounts, your brokerage accounts, and your retirement accounts remain accessible. For now. For now. 2 words, quiet, unhurried, and carrying the weight of a door swinging closed. Richard had negotiated contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He had sat in rooms with regulators, with federal investigators, with hostile takeover specialists who had dedicated years to dismantling the thing he'd built. He had never once, in any of those rooms, felt as outmaneuvered as he felt at this table, in this restaurant, in this hotel that apparently belonged to his wife. He needed to think. He needed his attorneys. He needed space and time, and the ability to process information without an audience. He pushed his chair back slightly. I need to make some calls. Of course, Victoria said. He stood. She remained seated perfectly still, looking up at him with an expression he could not decode. There's one more thing, she said. He stopped. The woman who had entered behind Victoria, the one he had barely registered, the one in the dark burgundy suit, stepped forward. She placed a small envelope on the table. Your room key has been deactivated, Victoria said. The presidential suite has been returned to the hotel's available inventory. Your personal belongings have been packed by housekeeping and are in a bag at the concierge desk in the main lobby. A car has been arranged to take you wherever you'd like to go. She paused. The car is not courtesy of the hotel. You'll be billed for it. Richard looked at the envelope, at his deactivated keycard inside it. You had my things removed, he said. I had my suite prepared for its next guest, she said. For a moment, one raw, unguarded moment, something cracked open in Richard Sterling's face. Not remorse, not guilt. Something older and uglier than either of those things, the specific horror of a man who has just understood for the first time that the story he has been telling about himself is not the story that was actually happening. He had believed he was the center. He had been a character in someone else's narrative the whole time. He straightened his jacket. It was instinct, the same gesture he made before walking into any difficult room. Present yourself correctly. Lead with the surface. He walked away from the table without another word. The restaurant watched him go. No one spoke. No one moved quite yet. The servers remained at their positions, the nearby diners carefully not looking directly. The room holding its collective breath in the way rooms do when something historic has just occurred in a very small space. Victoria picked up her water glass and drank from it with complete composure. The attorney began organizing his documents. At the concierge desk in the main lobby, Richard Sterling found a single leather overnight bag. His clothes were folded inside with more care than he deserved. His toiletries were zipped into a side pocket. His phone charger was coiled neatly and placed on top. He stood at the desk, holding the bag for a moment. The concierge, a young woman with careful posture and the professional neutrality of someone who had been briefed, looked at him with exactly the right amount of sympathy, which was to say, almost none. Your car is outside, Mr. Sterling, she said. Whenever you're ready. He looked at the lobby. At the marble floors, at the soaring ceiling, at the white flower arrangements on their pedestals, at the warm light that made everyone look slightly better than they were. At the 2 letters embossed on the elevator doors across the hall, VD. He had walked past those letters 20 times in 2 days. He walked through the lobby slowly. Not because he chose to, because his body was not receiving instructions efficiently anymore. Something had gone wrong in the connection between his mind and his limbs, between his intentions and his ability to execute them. He felt heavy and slow and strangely exposed, the way you feel when a fever breaks and you realize how sick you actually were. The main doors opened automatically as he approached. Outside, the city was doing what New York City always does at night, roaring quietly, moving in every direction, containing millions of lives that were completely indifferent to his. The car Victoria's team had arranged was there, a black sedan, the driver holding the door without expression. Richard stopped on the sidewalk. He took out his phone and called his attorney. Personal cell, not the office line. The call rang 4 times and went to voicemail. He called again. Voicemail. He called a second attorney, a partner at a different firm, someone he had used for a sensitive matter 3 years ago. That call was answered on the second ring. Richard. The attorney's voice was careful in a way that immediately told Richard everything. I've been expecting your call. You've been expecting it, Richard repeated. I received correspondence from Davenport Legal today, and from the court. A pause. Richard, I have to be honest with you. The documentation they've filed is comprehensive. This has been in preparation for a considerable period of time. How long? Another pause. Longer. From what I can determine from the initial filings, they began the legal groundwork approximately 34 months ago. 34 months ago. Richard did a rapid, involuntary calculation. 34 months ago, he had been taking Jessica to the hotel in Boston for the first time. 34 months ago, Victoria had served him dinner and asked about his week and listened to his answer and smiled and said goodnight, and apparently at some point in those same 24 hours, begun building the legal architecture of his complete dismantling. What's my exposure? He asked. Richard, what is my exposure? The attorney exhaled slowly. Without full access to their filings, I can't give you a number. But given what I'm seeing, given the asset structures involved, the Davenport holdings, the controlling interest position she's taken in your firm. He stopped. You should prepare yourself for a significant restructuring of your financial life. Significant restructuring. Richard had used that phrase himself in board meetings when a company was facing collapse, and he needed language that sounded manageable without being dishonest. I need you in my office Monday morning, he said. Of course. Richard, where are you staying tonight? He looked back at this Grand Elysian, at the golden light pouring through its glass facade, at the doorman standing at the entrance with the practiced dignity of someone who worked for a remarkable institution, at the VD monogram lit softly above the door. I'm figuring that out, he said, and ended the call. The driver was still waiting, the car door still open. Richard got in. He sat in the back seat of the car with his overnight bag on the seat beside him and watched the Grand Elysian fall away behind them through the window, and he tried to assemble the pieces of the evening into something that made sense, into some narrative where he retained a functional role, where there was a move left to make. But every time he reached for the thread, it led him back to the same place, to a certificate of ownership on a white tablecloth, to his wife's handwriting on divorce papers that had already been filed, to 2 letters on an elevator panel that he had written inside 40 times without once asking what they meant. VD. His phone lit up. A number he didn't recognize. He almost didn't answer it. Sterling, he said. Mr. Sterling. A woman's voice. Calm, professional. This is Clara Whitfield calling on behalf of the board of Sterling Capital Partners. I apologize for the late hour. The board convened an emergency session this evening, and I've been asked to reach you directly. Richard's grip on the phone tightened. An emergency session, he said. Yes, sir. In light of the change in controlling shareholder interest that was disclosed to the board this afternoon. She paused. The professional pause of someone who is about to deliver something that cannot be softened by any amount of professional courtesy. The board has voted to request your resignation as CEO, effective immediately pending a formal transition meeting on Monday. The city moved past the window. Buildings, people, lights, all of it continuing without any awareness that Richard Sterling's life was being disassembled piece by piece in the back of a sedan. "My resignation," he said. "Yes, sir. The vote was unanimous." He had built Sterling Capital Partners from a two-person operation in a rented office in Midtown. He had grown it over 22 years into a firm managing north of $4 billion in assets. He had given it the name on the door and the culture in the hallways and the reputation that attracted clients who had other options. Unanimous. "I'll need to review the legal basis for Mr. Sterling," Clara Whitfield said gently but absolutely. "The controlling shareholder has the authority. The board has confirmed the vote. I'm sorry. I truly am." She ended the call. Richard sat in silence. The driver's eyes appeared briefly in the rearview mirror, not intrusive, just present. "Sir, do you have a destination?" Richard thought about his townhouse in the West Village, the one where Victoria was not currently present because Victoria was currently in her hotel in her restaurant with her attorneys. The one that was almost certainly also subject to proceedings he had not yet fully read. "A hotel," he said. "Something midtown." "Of course, sir. Any preference?" He almost said the Grand Elysian. The absurdity of it hit him like cold water, the specific devastating absurdity of a man who, in the shock of losing everything, almost returned by instinct to the place that had taken it all from him. "Anything," he said. "Just drive." The car moved north through the city, and Richard Sterling sat in the back with his overnight bag and his phone and the wreckage of an evening that had begun so precisely as he had planned it, and he thought about what his wife had said. "You stopped paying attention to me a very long time ago." That's the how. Not a dramatic revelation, not a villain's monologue, just a fact stated plainly by a woman who had spent years being invisible to the man sitting across from her and had used that invisibility to build something extraordinary. He had thought silence meant surrender. He had never once considered that it might mean strategy. His phone lit up again. Jessica this time. He stared at her name on the screen. He did not answer. The call went to voicemail. Then a text appeared. "Richard, what is happening? They actually deactivated my key. I'm in the lobby with my bags. Please call me back, please." He read the message. He put the phone face down on the seat. Outside the window, New York City continued in every direction, indifferent and vast, and full of people who were asleep, and people who were awake, and people who were in the middle of the worst nights of their lives, and people who were in the middle of the best ones, all of them moving through the same dark city without any awareness of each other's catastrophes. Richard Sterling sat very still. And for the first time in as long as he could remember, possibly for the first time since he was 17 years old in his father's dark kitchen, he had no plan. He had nothing, except the slow-arriving understanding that the woman he had spent 16 years dismissing as quiet and predictable and invisible had been the entire time, every single day, through every lie and every dismissal, and every moment he had looked through her rather than at her, the most powerful person in the room. He just hadn't been paying attention. Part 3. The morning. Everything he built began to burn. The hotel Richard ended up in that night was not the Grand Elysian. It was a perfectly respectable midtown property, clean, professional, the kind of place that business travelers booked without thinking twice, and it was so aggressively ordinary compared to where he had spent the previous 2 nights that the contrast alone felt like a punishment. The room smelled like generic carpet cleaner and recycled air. The bed was fine. The window looked out at another building. He sat on the edge of that bed at 11:43 at night with his phone in his hand and his overnight bag still zipped on the floor, and he did not sleep for a very long time. He called his personal attorney again at midnight, got voicemail again, left a message that he worked hard to keep controlled, and that was only partially successful. He opened the folder the attorney had left on the restaurant table. He had taken it without thinking, some reflex of a man who always leaves a room with the documents, and he sat with it in the yellow lamplight and read. All 43 pages of tab 4. It took him an hour and 20 minutes. Not because it was difficult language, he had read thousands of legal documents in his career, but because every few pages he had to stop and sit with what he was reading, had to let it settle before he could continue. The acquisitions were clean and precise and structured in a way that his own legal team would have been proud of, and probably would have been proud of, because 2 of the firms listed in the transaction chain were firms he had recommended to Victoria years ago when she asked him over dinner one evening if he knew anyone good in corporate law. He had given her the names without asking why she needed them. He had not asked because he had not considered that her reasons might be worth understanding. He finished the document at 1:17 in the morning, set it on the bed beside him, and sat in silence for a while. Then he called his son. Daniel Sterling was 22 years old, finishing his final semester at Georgetown, and he answered his father's call on the third ring with the particular wariness of a young man who knew that a phone call from his father at 1 in the morning was not going to be good news. "Dad." Not a greeting, an acknowledgement. "Daniel." Richard paused. "I need you to know that some things are happening, between your mother and me. I wanted to call you before you heard it from somewhere else." Silence on the other end. "What kind of things?" Daniel said. "Your mother has filed for divorce." More silence. Longer this time. "Okay," Daniel said finally. "Just that. Okay." Richard had expected more shock questions, the particular distress of a child learning his parents' marriage was ending. He had prepared himself for that conversation. He had not prepared for the flatness of that single word, Daniel. "Dad, I've been waiting for this call for about 2 years, his son said. The evenness in his voice was not coldness exactly. It was something more considered than coldness. "I'm surprised it took this long, honestly." Richard felt something shift in his chest. "You knew." "I knew something," Daniel said. "Mom never said anything directly. She never complained about you, actually, not once. That's kind of what told me." A pause. People who are happy in their marriages don't have to work that hard at not complaining. Richard stared at the wall of the hotel room. "I handled some things very badly," he said. It was as close to an admission as he had ever come in his life, and it came out smaller than he intended. "Yeah," Daniel said. "You did." No anger in it, just agreement. "Is Mom okay?" "Your mother is..." Richard paused. "Your mother is fine. More than fine." "Good," Daniel said. "That's the only thing I needed to know." Another pause. "I have an early class, Dad. I'll call you this weekend." He ended the call. Richard sat with the phone in his hand for a long time after that. His son had been waiting 2 years. His 22-year-old son had seen what Richard, with all his experience and intelligence and financial sophistication, had refused to see. Had seen it from a distance, from a college campus, from the particular vantage point of a child who had grown up watching both parents and understood the temperature of the room in ways that Richard, the man who believed he controlled all temperatures, had never bothered to learn. He did not call his daughter. Emma was 19, and she and Richard had always had a more complicated relationship. She had her mother's stillness and her mother's patience, and he was beginning to understand probably her mother's capacity for seeing exactly what was in front of her without being told. He would call Emma tomorrow, or she would call him. Either way, he suspected the conversation would be remarkably similar to the one he'd just had. He lay back on the hotel bed in his shirt and trousers. He hadn't changed, hadn't unpacked, and looked at the ceiling until sometime after 3 in the morning, when exhaustion finally overtook him and he slept. He dreamed about the letters VD. He dreamed about them on every surface. He touched his coffee cup in the morning, the steering wheel of his car, the door of his office, the cover of every report he had ever filed. He woke up at 6:48 with a start and lay there in the gray early light, feeling the specific disorientation of a man whose internal compass has been demagnetized and is spinning without reference. His phone had 17 new notifications. He sat up and looked at them in order. 3 missed calls from Jessica, the last one at 2:14 in the morning. A voicemail from his attorney Jeffrey Harmon's firm, marked urgent. A text from a colleague at the firm, or a former colleague, technically saying simply heard the news. Call me when you can. 2 emails from financial journalists whose names he recognized. 1 email from the building management company that handled his West Village townhouse regarding access arrangements pending legal proceedings. 1 text from a number he didn't recognize that turned out to be from someone at the Wall Street Journal asking for comment on a story they were running in the business section. And at 7:03, a text from Victoria. He opened hers first. It read, "The children have been informed. Emma called me at midnight. She's fine. She sends her love to me. I thought you should know they're both handling it with considerably more grace than might be expected. That reflects well on them. It does not reflect well on us. Then after a line break, my attorneys will be in touch with yours this week. Please do not contact me directly during proceedings. This is not personal. It is practical. There is a difference. You said that to me once. I found it useful." He read it twice. Then he called Jeffrey Harmon's firm and got through to a junior partner named Marcus Webb, who had been assigned to his case, and who had the careful, measured delivery of a young attorney who was aware that the client on the phone was someone significant, and was also aware that the situation was considerably worse than that client yet fully understood. "Mr. Sterling, thank you for calling back. I want to walk you through where things stand." "Please," Richard said. "The controlling interest acquisition your wife completed in Sterling Capital Partners represents approximately 31% of the firm's outstanding shares acquired over a 26-month period through several intermediary entities. The board's position, which they communicated formally last night, is that this transfer of controlling interest represents a material change in ownership that triggers a leadership review under the firm's own operating agreement." Marcus paused. "To be direct with you, sir, the board's vote was not a request. It's enforceable." "I built that firm," Richard said. "Yes, sir, and the operating agreement you signed when you took on outside investors in 2019 contains provisions that the current board is citing as the legal basis for—" "I know it's in the operating agreement," Richard said more sharply than he intended. "I wrote half of it." "Yes, sir. Then you'll know that Section 14B covers change of control in the event of a majority shareholder shift. Your wife's holding combined with the existing institutional shares crosses the threshold." A pause. "I'm sorry, Mr. Sterling. I know this is not what you want to hear." Richard walked to the window of the hotel room and looked out at the building across the street. Someone in an office on the 4th floor was already at their desk, moving efficiently, doing whatever it was they did. A normal Monday morning for someone. "What's my realistic position?" he asked. Marcus was quiet for a moment, in the way that attorneys are quiet when the answer they have to give is one they have had to give before, and it never becomes easier. "Realistically, the divorce settlement will be the central issue. Your personal assets, what's held independently outside of joint structures, those should be protected. But the firm's assets, the value of your equity stake, those are all subject to the proceedings now. And the timeline your wife's team has built suggests they've been thorough, very thorough." 34 months thorough," Richard said quietly. "Pardon, nothing. Keep going." "The cleanest path forward in my assessment is to approach the settlement negotiation cooperatively rather than adversarially. Given the documentation they've compiled and the asset positions they've established, a contested divorce would be expensive public, and I have to be honest, unlikely to result in a materially better outcome for you than a negotiated one." Richard said nothing. "Mr. Sterling." "I heard you," he said. He ended the call and stood at the window for a while longer. The person in the office across the street had moved to a different part of their workspace. Still working, still moving. Whatever they were doing it with complete focus, complete normalcy, completely unaware that Richard Sterling was standing 50 feet away watching them while his life reorganized itself into something he did not recognize. He showered. He changed into the spare clothes in his overnight bag. He ordered coffee from room service and sat at the small desk in the corner of the room with a legal pad and a pen, the way he had always worked through complex problems, analog physical. The scratch of pen on paper, organizing his thoughts in a way that screens never quite managed. He wrote down everything he knew. It took 40 minutes and covered 3 pages. He looked at what he had written, and he saw laid out in his own handwriting the complete picture for the first time. Not fragments, not the pieces arriving one by one in crisis, but the whole thing assembled. What Victoria had built, what she had known. What she had done and when she had done it, and how long she had been doing it while he sat across from her at dinner and talked about his day and accepted her attention as his due, and never once looked closely enough to see the depth behind her eyes. He sat with those 3 pages for a long time. Then his phone rang, a number he did not recognize, but with a New York area code. "Sterling," he said. "Mr. Sterling, my name is Patricia Osei. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of the Davenport Hospitality Group." Her voice was professional and warm, in equal measure the voice of someone who had learned to be both simultaneously. "I'm calling on behalf of the chairwoman." Richard straightened slightly. "Victoria asked you to call me. She asked me to relay some information regarding the townhouse." "What about it?" "The property at West 11th Street is held in a trust that, per the documentation filed with the court, is subject to a temporary restraining order preventing disposition or change of occupancy during proceedings. That's standard." A brief pause. However, Mrs. Sterling, the chairwoman, has instructed me to let you know that she has no intention of disrupting your access to the property during proceedings. You're welcome to return home." Richard blinked. "She's letting me back into the house." "She's informing you of your legal right to occupy the marital residence," Patricia said carefully. "She has moved to other accommodations for the duration of the proceedings. She wanted you to know the house is accessible." He sat with that for a moment. Victoria had left their home, had moved out quietly without drama, without a scene, had simply organized herself into a different space, and then sent someone to tell him the coast was clear, as if she were managing a property transition, which he supposed she was. This was what she did. This was what she had always done, managed complex logistics with invisible efficiency while the people around her went about their lives without noticing. "Thank you," he said. "Of course. The chairwoman also asked me to pass along one additional message." Patricia paused. She said, and I'm quoting directly, "The children's college accounts are untouched and fully funded. That was never in question." Richard closed his eyes. Of course it wasn't. Of course she had done that. Of course the first thing Victoria had thought to protect in the middle of dismantling everything else was the children's futures. That was so completely Victoria that it made something painful move through him. Not guilt exactly, but its more sophisticated cousin, the feeling of recognizing the value of something at the precise moment you have lost the right to claim it. "Tell her I said thank you," he said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. "I will," Patricia said. "Take care of yourself, Mr. Sterling." She ended the call. He packed his overnight bag, checked out of the hotel, got into a cab and gave the West Village address. The townhouse was exactly as he had left it Saturday morning. Neat quiet, the particular organized stillness of a home that had been cared for with consistency and attention over many years. Victoria's attention, Victoria's consistency. He walked through the hallways and the rooms and saw in a way he had not seen before the evidence of her everywhere. The choices she had made, the care she had put into every corner of the space they had shared. It was not decorated dramatically. It was not the kind of house that announced itself. It was the kind of house that felt when you walked into it like someone had been paying attention to what made a home feel like a home rather than a showpiece. He had always taken that for granted. He stood in the kitchen and made coffee, and his phone rang again, and this time it was a name he recognized with a cold jolt: James Carver, one of his oldest colleagues in the industry, a man who had been for 20 years something close to a friend. "James," he said. "Richard." James's voice had the texture of a man choosing his words carefully. "I heard. I wanted to call you directly." "I appreciate that. I need to be straight with you, Richard, because I think you need to hear it from someone who actually gives a damn about you." James paused. "The story is moving. It's going to be in the Journal tomorrow morning, the business section. And it's not going to be—" He stopped. "It's not going to be kind." Richard set down his coffee. "What's the angle?" "Hostile takeover of a CEO's own firm by his estranged wife, with details." James cleared his throat. "Richard, someone talked. Someone with access gave them details of the acquisition structure, the board vote, the hotel situation. I don't know who—" "I do," Richard said quietly. He didn't actually, but he had a reasonable short list. The hotel, the restaurant, the board meeting. Jessica possibly, though. Jessica barely understood what had happened to her own employment last night, let alone the structural architecture of a 34-month legal operation. "How bad is it going to be?" he asked. James was quiet for a moment. That said everything. "You need to get ahead of it," James finally said. "Today. You need a statement. You need to be visible. You need to control the first version of this narrative, or someone else is going to do it for you." "There is no version of this narrative I control," Richard said. It came out flat and certain. "James, I walked into her hotel with another woman. That's the story. That's the whole story. There is no version of that I get to spin." Another silence. "No," James said quietly. "I suppose there isn't." They talked for a few more minutes about practical things who Richard should call, what his options were for positioning in the market going forward, which relationships in the industry would hold, and which would evaporate. It was a useful conversation, and it was also a devastating one because Richard could hear underneath all of it, in the careful way James was helping him think about a future outside of Sterling Capital Partners, in the way he was not even raising the possibility of reversing the board decision, the shape of the new reality settling into place. He was no longer Richard Sterling of Sterling Capital Partners. He was just Richard Sterling, and he was not yet sure who that was. After he ended the call with James, he sat at the kitchen table in his own house for a very long time, without moving. It was nearly noon when his phone buzzed with a text notification. Not a call, a text, and not from an attorney or a colleague or one of his children. From Victoria. He opened it. It read, "I know you're at the house. I left something for you on the desk in the study. It's not legal documents. You don't have to read it. But I thought after everything you deserve to understand rather than just experience." He sat with that text for a full minute. Then he got up and walked to the study. On the desk, his desk, the one where he had spent thousands of hours over the years building the career he was now in the process of losing, was a single cream-colored envelope. His name written on the front in Victoria's handwriting. Not their last name. Just Richard. He picked it up. He held it. He did not open it right away. He stood at the desk with the envelope in both hands and felt the weight of it, which was not heavy at all, which was just paper and whatever words she had decided after 34 months of legal preparation and 16 years of marriage, and whatever years before that of being the kind of woman the world overlooked to leave for him. He sat down in his chair. He opened the envelope. The letter inside was 2 pages handwritten on hotel stationery Grand Elysian, the VD monogram at the top. He recognized the deliberateness of that choice immediately. She had written it there, in her hotel. At some point during the weekend while he was on the floor above her performing a version of his life that he had believed was entirely hidden, he began to read. She did not begin with anger. She did not begin with accusations, or with a list of grievances, or with the procedural language of someone who had spent 3 years with attorneys. She began with a memory. She wrote about a dinner early in their marriage at a restaurant in the West Village that no longer existed. She wrote about sitting across from him at a small table and watching him talk about his work, a deal he was putting together, something complex and ambitious, and feeling she wrote something she could only describe as the specific happiness of being in the presence of someone who was fully alive to their own purpose. She had loved that about him, she wrote. She had loved watching him be exactly what he was made to be. Richard read that paragraph 3 times. She wrote about the years that followed, about watching that energy, the same energy she had loved, slowly redirect itself away from their shared life and toward everything else. About noticing at first with confusion and then with a grief she never named aloud that she had become in his mind part of the infrastructure. Not a person he was with, a structure that supported the life he was actually living. She wrote, "I want to be fair to you, Richard. I believe you never made a conscious decision to stop seeing me. I believe you simply got very busy being who you were, and I got very quiet, trying not to be in the way, and somewhere in the middle of those 2 things, we stopped being a marriage and became an arrangement. I accept my part in that. I should have spoken louder sooner. I chose not to. That was my failure." Then she wrote, "But a woman can only be invisible for so long before she decides to use it." He put the letter down on the desk, sat back in his chair. Outside the windows of his study, the West Village moved through its Sunday afternoon with complete indifference. People walking dogs, people carrying coffee, people who were not in the middle of understanding something terrible and true about themselves. He picked up the letter and kept reading. She wrote about the Davenport group, about her grandfather, about her mother, about the inheritance she had stepped into at 24 and grown over the following 20-odd years into something that spanned 11 countries and employed over 12,000 people. She wrote about the decision she had made early in their marriage to keep that world separate. Not to hide it from him she had tried. She wrote twice in the first year to bring it up to share it with him, to let him into that part of herself. Both times, she wrote, he had listened for approximately 4 minutes before steering the conversation back to his own work. She had stopped trying after the second time. She wrote, "I don't tell you this to wound you. I tell you because I want you to understand that what happened this weekend was not an ambush, Richard. It was an arrival. I spent 16 years building something real. You spent 16 years not noticing. At some point, you have to arrive. The last paragraph was short. She wrote, "I do not hate you. I want to be clear about that because I think you might expect that I do, and I don't want you to spend energy defending yourself against something that isn't there. What I feel, if I'm being completely honest, is a kind of freedom I haven't felt in a very long time. I hope when the dust settles, you find something like that too. You were a better man once than the one you became. That man is still in there. I saw him. I married him. I just couldn't keep waiting for him to come back." Richard sat in his chair in his quiet study in the house his wife had left. He read the last paragraph a second time. Then he folded the letter carefully along its original creases, placed it back in the cream envelope, and held it in his hands for a long time without moving. Outside, the afternoon light was shifting. His phone buzzed on the desk beside him. He glanced at it without moving his head. Another journalist, another former colleague, another notification from some corner of his professional world, registering in real time the story beginning to move through the networks that had defined his life for 30 years. He left the phone where it was. He sat in the chair that had been his chair in the room that had been his room in the house that was his house, in the same way the Grand Elysian had been his hotel completely entirely, and not at all. And Richard Sterling, for the first time in his adult life, did not reach for a strategy. He simply sat with what he had done. The Wall Street Journal ran the story on Monday morning at 6:47 a.m. Richard knew the exact time because he was already awake, had been awake since 4:30, sitting at the kitchen table in the West Village townhouse with cold coffee and Victoria's letter open beside him, when his phone began vibrating with the kind of sustained overlapping frequency that only happens when something has been published and the people who know you are reading it simultaneously. He did not reach for the phone immediately. He knew what was coming. James had warned him. He had had all of Sunday to prepare himself for it. But there is a particular distance between knowing something is coming and experiencing the actual arrival of it, and Richard Sterling sat in that distance for approximately 4 minutes before he picked up the phone and opened the article. The headline read, "Power Reversal: How a Hotel Heiress Quietly Dismantled Her Husband's Empire from the Inside." He read it in full. It took 11 minutes. It was thorough. It was accurate. It was written with the restrained precision of a journalist who understood that the facts were dramatic enough without embellishment, and who had clearly had access to sources close to both the legal proceedings and the Grand Elysian incident. The article described the acquisition of Sterling Capital Partners shares in specific detail. It described the board vote. It described in a single paragraph that Richard read 3 times a scene in the Aurelius restaurant at the Grand Elysian Hotel on Saturday evening that was detailed enough to make clear that someone present, a diner, a server, someone had spoken to the reporter. The article did not name Jessica. It referred to her only as a companion, which was its own kind of precision. What it did name in full with considerable context and admiration that Richard could not help but notice, even through the haze of his own humiliation, was Victoria Eleanor Davenport Sterling, chairwoman of the Davenport Hospitality Group, described as one of the most quietly influential figures in global hospitality, who had deliberately maintained a low public profile throughout her marriage, and was now, in the words of 3 separate industry sources quoted in the piece, stepping fully into the public role her position had always warranted. There was a photograph. Victoria, at some industry event Richard did not recognize, in a dark suit, standing with the relaxed authority of a woman completely at home in her own power. She was not smiling for the camera the way people smile when they are performing confidence. She was simply looking at it, direct, composed, exactly herself. Richard stared at the photograph for a long time. His phone was ringing, had been ringing since the article dropped. He silenced it without looking at the screen and set it face down on the table. He needed 10 minutes of quiet before the day swallowed him. He got 6. At 7:03, the front door buzzer sounded. He ignored it. It sounded again, then a third time longer. He went to the intercom. "Who is it?" "It's Marcus Webb, sir, from Harmon Associates. I apologize for the early hour. Mr. Harmon asked me to come in person." Richard pressed the button to release the door. Marcus Webb was 29, possibly 30, with the kind of earnest competence that expensive law schools produced in consistent quantities. He came in carrying a briefcase and a cup of coffee he had clearly been holding for sustenance rather than enjoyment, and he sat at Richard's kitchen table with the measured urgency of a young man who had something significant to deliver and was aware that the person receiving it was not having a good morning. "You've seen the journal," Marcus said. I have. We anticipated this. Mr. Harmon wants to move quickly on a response strategy. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a folder. We've prepared a preliminary statement for your review, something measured that positions you as cooperating fully with proceedings and committed to a respectful resolution. Richard looked at the statement. It was 2 paragraphs. Professional neutral entirely without admission of anything while being entirely without denial of anything. The precise language of managed crisis. Fine, he said. Send it. Marcus looked slightly surprised. He had clearly prepared for more resistance. Just like that. Marcus, Richard said, what exactly do you think I'm going to fight? The article is accurate. The documents are legitimate. My wife has been chairwoman of a hospitality empire for 6 years, and I apparently didn't know it. There is no statement in the world that improves that situation. So yes, send whatever controls the damage best, and let's move on to what actually matters. Marcus nodded slowly. The settlement negotiations. When do they want to begin? Mrs. Sterling's team has proposed Wednesday, 10 a.m. at their offices. Their offices, of course. Richard thought about that for a moment, sitting in a conference room in a building owned by the Davenport Group, across from Victoria's attorneys negotiating the terms of the life he was no longer going to have. There was something almost geometrically perfect about it that he would have appreciated in a different context. Wednesday is fine, he said. Marcus left at 7:45. Richard showered, dressed in a suit out of habit, then stopped, looked at himself in the mirror, and took the jacket off and hung it back up. He put on a different shirt, something simpler. He was not going to a board meeting. He was not performing authority for anyone today. He was a man in his own house who needed to think clearly. He was on his second cup of coffee when Emma called. His daughter's voice when he answered was steady, in the way that young people are sometimes steady when they have made a decision about how to handle something before the conversation begins. Dad. Emma, I was going to call you today. I know you were. A brief pause. I talked to Mom last night, and again this morning. How is she? She sounds like herself, Emma said. Just more. Like a louder version of herself, like someone turned up a dial that I didn't know could go any higher. Another pause. She told me about the hotel, about Saturday night. Richard said nothing. Dad, I need to ask you something, and I need you to actually answer me. Go ahead. Did you ever even once think about what it would do to her? Not the divorce, not the legal stuff, the actual thing. Did you ever sit across from her and think about what she was carrying while you were... Emma stopped. He could hear her breathing, hear her working to keep her voice level. While you were doing what you were doing. Richard sat with the question. He did not reach for a defense. He had spent enough time in this kitchen in the last 24 hours, reading his wife's letter, to have arrived somewhere just past the point where defense felt like a possibility. No, he said, I didn't. The honesty of it seemed to land differently than Emma had expected. She was quiet for a moment. Okay, she said. Thank you for that, Emma. I'm not cutting you off, Dad. I want you to know that. You're my father, and I love you, and that doesn't just stop. But I'm very angry right now, and I think we both need some time before this conversation goes deeper. A pause. Mom built something extraordinary. Did you know that about the hotels? I'm learning about it now, he said. She never told me either, Emma said. Not once. We had conversations about her work, and she always just said hospitality management, and I never pushed because she always seemed like she was steering away from it, and I didn't want to pry. A short, slightly disbelieving laugh. 118 hotels, Dad. 11 countries, and she's been running it from our dining room table. Richard closed his eyes. I know, he said. I looked her up last night, Emma continued, after I got off the phone with her. Just looked her up online properly for the first time. Do you know there are industry profiles of her going back 15 years, Forbes? Hospitality World. 2 different business school case studies about the Davenport Group's employee welfare model. Her voice had shifted from anger into something stranger, something that Richard recognized after a moment as awe. She's kind of a legend, Dad, in her whole industry, and we just had dinner with her and complained about traffic. Richard said nothing for a moment. Then he said, she was protecting something. What? Her world. From us. From me. He thought about the letter on the table beside him. I think she was afraid that if she brought it fully into our life, it would I don't know. Become part of what I managed. Part of the infrastructure. Silence on Emma's end. That's very perceptive, Dad, she said, and her tone held something complicated in it. Not quite forgiveness, not quite warmth, but the acknowledgement of a man moving slowly in the right direction. I'm working on it, he said. He spent the rest of Monday making calls he had been avoiding and taking calls from people he had not expected. 3 clients from Sterling Capital Partners reached out directly not to discuss their portfolios, but to say in various ways that they were sorry for how things had gone, which was its own kind of revelation that the human response was arriving before the financial one. His housekeeper, a woman named Ruth, who had worked for them for 11 years, called to ask if he needed anything. He told her no, and then changed his mind and said, actually, yes, if she had time, could she come by tomorrow? And she said, of course, and did not ask any questions. By Tuesday afternoon, the statement Marcus had sent had run in 2 publications and 3 financial news sites, and the tone of the coverage was shifting slightly from gleeful exposure towards something more measured, which meant the crisis communications were working in the limited way that crisis communications work, which is to say, they were converting catastrophe into mere disaster. Richard understood the difference. He had watched it happen to others. He had not expected to be on this side of it. Wednesday morning arrived with the cold clarity of a November day that had decided to be honest about itself. Richard wore the charcoal suit, not the Brioni, the other one, the one from a younger, slightly less performative period of his career. He took a cab to the offices of Davenport Legal Partners on Park Avenue, rode the elevator to the 14th floor, and was shown into a conference room by a young man who offered him water and coffee with the professional courtesy of someone who had been specifically instructed to treat him well. Victoria's lead attorney was a woman named Caroline Marsh. Richard had looked her up Tuesday night and learned that she was 53, had spent 2 decades at one of the city's top family law firms, and had a reputation for being the person that people called when they needed someone who was both brilliant and completely unwilling to be intimidated. She walked into the conference room at exactly 10 o'clock, shook his hand with a directness that acknowledged the situation without dramatizing it, and sat down. Mr. Sterling, thank you for being on time. Mrs. Marsh. He looked around the table. 3 members of her team, Marcus Webb beside him. No Victoria. He had not expected Victoria. He had not been sure whether he was relieved or disappointed by her absence, and he was not yet sure which of those feelings told him something true. Let's begin. What followed was 4 hours that Richard would remember for the rest of his life, not because they were dramatic, but because they were the opposite of dramatic. Caroline Marsh and her team were precise, thorough, and entirely without malice. They presented the proposed settlement framework in sections, answered every question directly, and never once raised their voices or deployed the kind of subtle intimidation that Richard had expected and would have known how to meet. Victoria had instructed them apparently to be fair, not generous. Fair. There was a difference, and Caroline made it clear early on. The Davenport holdings were entirely Victoria's predating the marriage and were not part of the settlement equation. Richard's personal assets, his independent investment accounts, his retirement holdings, the portfolio he had built outside the firm, those remained his. The townhouse would be sold and the proceeds split. His equity stake in Sterling Capital Partners, now complicated by the controlling interest situation, would be valued independently and addressed separately. She was not taking everything. He had expected her to take everything. He had spent 3 days preparing himself for the specific sensation of being left with nothing, and the actual terms fair considered precisely what the law would have produced without vindictiveness and somewhat better than he deserved, unsettled him more than total destruction would have. At the lunch break, Marcus leaned over and said quietly, "This is a significantly better position than I anticipated going in." "I know," Richard said. "She could have gone harder." "I know." Marcus looked at him for a moment. "Why didn't she—" Richard thought about the letter, about the last paragraph. "I do not hate you. I want to be clear about that. Because she's not doing this to punish me," he said. "She's doing it to be free of me. Those are different things." At 3:15, Caroline gathered her documents and prepared to close the session. "One more item," she said, opening a final folder. "Mrs. Sterling has asked me to convey something directly outside of the legal framework." She glanced at her notes, then looked at Richard. She said the charitable foundation we established in 2018 will continue operating under its original mandate. She has no intention of dissolving it or redirecting its funding. She believes the work it does is important, regardless of the circumstances of the marriage. She wanted you to know that. Richard had established the foundation with Victoria 6 years ago. It funded educational programs in underserved communities, something Victoria had cared about, with a consistency that he had admired when he thought about it, and mostly not thought about. He had put his name on it. She had done most of the work. He looked at Caroline Marsh and said, "Tell her thank you." Caroline nodded. "There's one more thing she asked me to pass along," Caroline said, and something in her tone shifted slightly. Something that was not quite professional neutrality anymore. Something that the attorney had perhaps not entirely expected to feel in a room like this. She said he was not always wrong about everything. He was just wrong about what mattered most. The conference room was very quiet. Richard sat with that sentence for a moment. Then he said, "She's right," and meant it completely. He was back in the townhouse by 5 o'clock. He stood in the entry hallway for a moment without moving, taking in the specific quality of the silence that had settled into the house since Victoria had left. Not the silence of emptiness exactly, but the silence of a space that has been cared for and is now resting, waiting to understand what it was going to become next. He walked to the kitchen, made coffee, stood at the counter drinking it and looking at nothing in particular. His phone buzzed. A text from Daniel. "How did it go today?" He typed back, "Better than I deserved." 3 dots appeared. "Then that's kind of what I expected her to do." Then after a moment, "She's a good person, Dad. She always was." Richard set the phone down on the counter. He thought about the version of himself at 17 in his father's kitchen, making a promise about the man he was going to become. He had kept that promise in all the ways that were visible and measurable, the career, the money, the status, the rooms that responded to him, and had broken it in all the ways that weren't. The man he had promised to become was not a man who made his wife invisible, was not a man who mistook silence for acceptance or invisibility for agreement, was not a man who walked into a hotel with another woman and spent 2 days not noticing that the woman he had left at home owned every floor of the building. He had built the wrong things, and this thought arrived slowly with the kind of precision that only comes from genuine reckoning. He had built the right things in the wrong direction, pointed his energy and intelligence and ambition entirely outward, and left the interior of his life completely unattended, the way you leave a room you don't use until one day you open the door and realize something has been growing in the dark in there for years. He was 51 years old. He did not know exactly what came next. The firm was gone, or his role in it was, which amounted to the same thing. The marriage was ending with a completeness and a fairness that he had not earned. The life he had organized so carefully around the image of himself as the most powerful person in every room had been revealed in the course of a single weekend to have been built on a fundamental misunderstanding of where power actually lived. But he was 51, not dead. And somewhere underneath the wreckage of the last 3 days, underneath the shock and the humiliation and the particular grief of a man who has read his wife's letter and recognized himself in it and not liked what he found, something was moving, something quiet and new and unfamiliar. He picked up his phone and looked at it for a moment. Then he opened his contacts and scrolled to a name he had not called in nearly 4 years. A man named Robert Cho, who had been his closest friend in the early years of building the firm, before the success had made Richard too important for the friendship to survive on equal terms. Robert had left finance, eventually had gone into education, nonprofit work, and the last time they had spoken, Richard had been condescending about it in a way he had not recognized at the time as condescension. He called. Robert answered on the second ring, which meant either that he had been thinking about Richard or that he was the kind of person who answered calls from numbers he recognized regardless of the history attached to them. Richard had always suspected Robert was that kind of person and had found it naive at the time. He did not find it naive now. "Richard," Robert said, no surprise in his voice, "I saw the article." "I know. I'm calling to apologize." Richard paused. He was not experienced at this. "For the conversation we had 4 years ago about your decision to leave the firm. I was dismissive and I was wrong, and I should have said so a long time ago." Silence on Robert's end. Not cold silence. Surprised silence. "Well," Robert said after a moment. "Okay then. "I'm also calling because I need to talk to someone who isn't an attorney," Richard said, "and you're the only person I can think of who would tell me the truth without wanting something from the conversation." Robert laughed. It was a real laugh, unguarded and warm, the laugh of a man who had not lost his generosity despite having good reasons to. "You're lucky I pick up for people I used to know," he said. "Come on, tell me what's happening." Richard Sterling sat down at his kitchen table in the house that was almost no longer his, with his coffee cooling in front of him and the November light fading through the windows, and he talked. Not the way he had talked in the conference room, not the way he talked in board meetings, not the way he talked to attorneys or journalists, or the version of himself that he performed for the world. He talked the way his son had talked to him on Sunday night, flat and true, and without the protective architecture of a man managing his image. It was the first honest conversation he had allowed himself in years. Outside New York City moved through its evening in its enormous, indifferent way, carrying its millions of lives forward without waiting for any one of them to be ready. And Richard Sterling, for the first time in a very long time, was simply one of those lives, not the center, not the architect, not the most powerful man in the room. Just a man, trying late and imperfectly, and with the full weight of his failures sitting clearly in front of him to understand what he was actually made of. The townhouse sold in 3 weeks. Richard had not expected it to move that fast. He had lived in that house for 11 years, had walked its hallways so many thousands of times that the floorboards knew the specific weight of his step, and somehow the speed of its departure from his life felt like one final reminder that the world did not pause to accommodate his processing time. A young couple bought at a surgeon and her husband, both in their mid-30s, both visibly in love with the light in the kitchen and the garden out back that Victoria had tended with quiet dedication for a decade. Richard signed the papers on a Thursday morning and walked out with a check and a single box of personal items he had decided to keep, and he did not look back at the building as he got into the cab because he had learned in the months since November that looking back was a habit that cost more than it returned. He was living in a rental now. A 2-bedroom apartment on the Upper West Side, clean and anonymous, and entirely without the accumulated meaning of a place that has been genuinely lived in. The furniture was new, the walls were bare. He had not put anything on the walls because every time he stood in front of them with something in his hand he found he didn't yet know what he wanted to look at, which struck him as honest. It was February. 3 months since the Grand Elysian. 3 months since he had walked into a restaurant with a woman who was not his wife and walked out of it without his marriage, his firm, his identity, and the particular brand of self-assurance that had been the defining feature of his personality for 30 years. He was by any external measure considerably diminished. He was also by some internal measure, he was only beginning to understand how to read more awake than he had been in years. Robert Cho had become a regular presence in his life again. They met for coffee twice a week, sometimes 3 times in a diner on Broadway that had no particular distinction except that it was comfortable and nobody who worked in finance went there. Robert had the specific gift of listening without performing sympathy, of asking the exact question that cracked something open without making the crack feel like damage. Richard had forgotten what that kind of friendship felt like. He was relearning it the way you relearn something physical after an injury, carefully with full attention, grateful for every small increment of progress. "You seem different," Robert said one morning in early February, setting down his coffee cup and looking at Richard directly in the way that Richard had once found uncomfortable and now simply found honest. "Different how?" Richard said. "Quieter. In a good way. Like you're actually in the conversation instead of running it." Richard considered that. "I used to walk into rooms and immediately calculate the power structure," he said. "Who had leverage, who wanted something where I sat in the hierarchy. I did it automatically. Didn't even know I was doing it. And now I just walk in," Richard said. He picked up his own cup. "It's slower, but it's more interesting." Robert nodded slowly. "That's not nothing, Richard." "No," he said, "it isn't." The divorce had finalized in January, 14 weeks from filing to completion, which his attorney Marcus had described as remarkably efficient, and which Richard understood to be a reflection of how thoroughly Victoria had prepared, how cleanly she had structured the terms, and how completely she had eliminated the conditions for a protracted fight. There was nothing to fight over. She had been precise about what was hers and fair about what was his, and the whole thing had moved through the legal system with a quiet inevitability that matched he was beginning to understand everything else about her. He had not seen Victoria since the night at Aurelius. He had received through her attorneys the final paperwork. He had signed his name in all the places that required his name, and that was the end of 16 years reduced to the scratch of a pen on a page in a law office on Park Avenue, while Marcus sat beside him and said nothing because there was nothing useful to say. He had sat in the cab afterward and thought about the letter she had left him on the desk of his study. He had read it so many times over those 14 weeks that he no longer needed to open the envelope to hear her voice in it. He carried the sentences with him, the way you carry the words of someone who told you something true that you were not ready to hear when they said it, but that you have spent every day since learning to absorb. I just couldn't keep waiting for him to come back. He thought about that line a great deal. He was working on coming back. It was slow work and undramatic work, and there was no audience for it, which he was learning to be okay with. He had started consulting independent financial advisory work, smaller scale than Sterling Capital Partners, built on relationships with clients who had followed him personally rather than institutionally. It was not the life he had had. It was a real life which was different and in some ways harder and in some ways considerably better. He called his children every week without exception. Not the performative calls of a busy father checking a box, actual conversations, the kind where he asked questions and then listened to the full answers rather than waiting for the pause where he could redirect to something he wanted to say. Emma had thawed toward him incrementally, the way ice thaws not all at once, but in a process that was real and steady and governed by its own timeline rather than his. Daniel had become, unexpectedly, something close to a friend. His son called him sometimes just to talk, which was a thing that had never happened before November, and which Richard had decided to receive without comment, because commenting would have required acknowledging that it was new, and acknowledging that it was new would have required him to sit with the full weight of how much time he had wasted. He sat with it anyway. On the second Tuesday of February, Richard was in his apartment eating lunch alone when his phone rang with a number he did not recognize. He almost didn't answer. He had learned to be cautious about unknown numbers, journalists still called occasionally, and he had developed a reliable sense of which calls were worth taking. Something made him answer this one. "Mr. Sterling." A woman's voice, warm, professional, faintly accented in a way he couldn't immediately place. "Speaking." "My name is Dr. Amara Okonkwo. I'm the director of the Davenport Educational Foundation." A brief pause. "I'm calling about the charitable foundation you and Mrs. Sterling established in 2018. Richard straightened slightly. He had thought about the foundation more than he had expected to over the past months. He had reviewed its annual report in December. Victoria's team had sent it as a matter of course, since his name was still attached to it as a co-founder, and had read through it with the particular attention of a man who was reassessing what he had built and trying to determine which parts of it had actually mattered. The foundation mattered. Its programs were in 7 cities. It had funded full scholarships for over 400 students from underserved communities in 4 years. The educational outcomes data was objectively remarkable. He had put his name on it. Victoria had done the work. "I'm familiar with the foundation," he said. "I'm sure you are," Dr. Okonkwo said. "I'm calling because we're preparing for our annual board meeting in March and your name remains on our charter as co-founder. We wanted to reach out directly to ask whether you'd like to remain involved and in what capacity." Richard set down his fork. "Who asked you to call?" A pause. "Our board chair authorized the outreach." "And who is the board chair?" Another pause, slightly longer. "Mrs. Davenport," Dr. Okonkwo said. "She took over as board chair in January." Richard sat very still for a moment. Victoria had taken over the foundation, had restructured it formally under her own leadership, and had then, through Dr. Okonkwo, reached out to ask if he wanted to remain involved. She hadn't shut him out. She had offered him a door. Not a reconciliation, he understood that clearly and without confusion. That door was closed, and it was closed correctly, and he had no illusions about it. But this, the foundation, the work, the thing they had built that had nothing to do with power and leverage and everything to do with something that was actually good, this door was open. "I'd like to be involved," he said. "Wonderful," Dr. Okonkwo said. "I'll send you details for the March meeting." She ended the call. Richard sat at his kitchen table for a long time after that, thinking about what it meant that Victoria had done this. That she had, in the middle of dismantling everything else with absolute precision, preserved this one thing and then extended him an invitation to be part of it. It was the most generous thing anyone had ever done for him, and he almost certainly did not deserve it. He picked up the Foundation's annual report from the stack of papers on his kitchen table and opened it to the first page. There was a photograph of Dr. Okonkwo standing with a group of scholarship recipients at a ceremony in Chicago. The students were laughing. Real laughter, the kind that cannot be staged. They were wearing graduation caps at an angle and looking at each other with the specific joy of people who have been told they have a future and have decided to believe it. He looked at that photograph for a long time. Then he turned to the next page and started reading properly, with full attention the way he should have been reading it for 4 years. March arrived. The Foundation Board meeting was held in a conference room at the Davenport Group's New York headquarters, a building Richard had never visited, which itself said everything. He arrived 5 minutes early, signed in at the front desk, and took a seat in the conference room beside Dr. Okonkwo and 3 other board members he had not previously met. Victoria arrived at exactly 10 o'clock. She looked different than she had at Aurelius, not less powerful, more natural. She was wearing a deep blue blazer, and her hair was down, and she moved through the conference room with the specific ease of a person on their own ground. She greeted each board member by name and asked each of them one personal question, genuinely personal, demonstrating a real familiarity with their lives, before she sat at the head of the table. When she reached Richard, she stopped. They looked at each other for a moment. 4 months. The first time he had seen her face since the restaurant. He had been preparing for this without acknowledging he was preparing for it. Had been rehearsing some version of this encounter in the back of his mind since January, and now that it was actually happening, he found that all the prepared language had dissolved, and there was nothing left except the simple reality of standing 3 feet from the person he had been married to for 16 years, and knowing with full clarity what he had cost her. "Victoria," he said. "Richard." Her voice was even, not unkind. "Thank you for coming. Thank you for the invitation." She held his gaze for exactly the right amount of time, long enough to be real short enough to be appropriate, and then she moved to her chair and the meeting began. He watched her run the meeting. For 2 hours, he sat at that table and watched Victoria Davenport run a board meeting with a quality of leadership that he recognized immediately because he had spent 30 years trying to develop it himself. She listened to every person completely before responding. She disagreed with people directly, but without dismissiveness. She made decisions that were clearly already formed in her mind, but presented them in a way that allowed the room to arrive at them collectively, which was the hardest thing in leadership, and the thing that most people who believed themselves to be leaders never actually learned. She knew every student's name in the program reports, not generically specifically. She would say things like the young woman in Detroit, the one who wants to study architecture, how is she tracking in the spring semester, and Dr. Okonkwo would look slightly surprised and then look down and find the file and say she's doing extremely well, and Victoria would nod and make a note and move on. And Richard would sit with the specific sensation of realizing that his wife had been paying this quality of attention to things he had never once asked about. At the lunch break, the other board members moved to a side table where sandwiches had been arranged, and Richard found himself briefly alone with Victoria near the window. He could have said many things. He had in his mind composed many things over the past 4 months. He had composed apologies in several registers and lengths. He had composed explanations. He had composed questions. What came out was simpler than any of it. "You're extraordinary," he said. "I wanted you to know that I see that now, clearly." Victoria looked at him. Something moved across her face, not softness exactly, but the acknowledgement of something received. "Richard," she said quietly, "I have always been extraordinary. That was never the problem." He felt the truth of that land in exactly the place it was aimed. "I know," he said. She looked at him for a moment longer. "How are you?" she asked, and the question was real. He could tell the difference now between real questions and performed ones, and this was real. "I'm working on it," he said. She nodded. "Good." A pause. "The kids?" "Emma is thawing. Daniel calls me to talk, which is new." He paused. "They're both remarkable people. You did that." "We did that," she said. She said it without generosity, just as correction, just as the accurate version of the statement. He accepted the correction. She moved toward the lunch table, then she stopped and looked back at him once. "The foundation is doing important work," she said. "Stay involved, not for me, for them, for the students." She tilted her head slightly toward the board report on the table. "They deserve people who show up." She walked away. He stood at the window for a moment, looking out at the city. Then he walked to the table and got a cup of coffee and sat with the board members and talked about the spring program expansion with genuine interest and genuine attention. And it was not performed, and it was not strategic, and it felt in a way he had not felt in a very long time, like being present for something that actually mattered. In the months that followed, Richard Sterling quietly rebuilt. Not the same thing he had built before that was gone, and he had stopped pretending to grieve it, the way he was supposed to grieve it. The loss of Sterling Capital Partners, of the status of the particular shape of the life he had organized around his own primacy, those losses had stopped feeling like wounds and had started feeling like the removal of something he had been carrying too long without understanding its weight. His consulting practice grew steadily through referrals. He was good at the work, he had always been good at the work, and without the performance of empire around it, the work itself was cleaner and more satisfying than it had been in years. He took on smaller clients. He turned down several large institutional accounts that would have required the kind of aggressive self-promotion that he no longer had interest in. His income was a fraction of what it had been. He did not miss the number. He occasionally missed the validation that the number had represented, and when he missed it, he called Robert or went for a walk or sat with the discomfort until it passed, which it always did. He attended every foundation board meeting. He funded 2 additional scholarships personally, quietly, without announcing it. Dr. Okonkwo thanked him in an email, and he wrote back saying, "Please just make sure the students have what they need and let me know if there's more I can do." He did not see Victoria again until May. It was at the Foundation's annual scholarship ceremony held in a hotel ballroom, not the Grand Elysian, a different property, one that belonged to the city, rather than to anyone specific, where the year's scholarship recipients were recognized. There were 42 students this year. They ranged in age from 17 to 24. They came from 7 cities. Some of them were the first people in their families to attend college. Some of them were returning to education after years of working to support people who depended on them. They were extraordinary. Richard sat in the audience, not at the head table, not on the stage, just in a seat in the 3rd row like any other attendee, and he watched them cross the stage and receive their recognition, and he felt something that he did not have immediate language for. Not pride exactly, because pride implied ownership, and he owned nothing about what these people were doing. Not satisfaction, because satisfaction was too small. Something larger and less self-referential than either of those things. Victoria spoke at the ceremony. She stood at the podium without notes. She spoke about her grandfather who had built the first Davenport property in 1961, because he believed that hospitality, genuine hospitality, the real kind, was the practice of making people feel that they belonged somewhere. She spoke about her mother, who had taught her that power was not a destination but a responsibility. And then she looked out at the 42 students sitting in the front rows and said something that Richard wrote down on the back of the program because he knew he would want it later. She said, "The world will tell you very consistently and very loudly that the people who make the most noise are the ones who matter most. Do not believe it. The people who build the most lasting things are almost always the ones you didn't see coming. Be the person no one sees coming. Build something real. And never ever let anyone convince you that your silence means you have nothing to say." The room was very quiet for a moment after she said it. Then the applause started, and it was the kind of applause that begins from genuine feeling rather than obligation, uneven at the start, building naturally genuine. Richard clapped with everyone else. He did not seek her out after the ceremony. She was surrounded by students and board members and donors, and his presence at her side was not something that belonged in that moment. He clearly understood the difference between the places where he had a right to stand and the ones where he didn't, which was itself a form of growth that would have been unrecognizable to the man who had walked into the Grand Elysian 4 months earlier. He waited until the room had thinned, until most people had moved to the reception, and then he found Dr. Okonkwo and said, "Thank you for including me today." Dr. Okonkwo looked at him with the direct warmth of someone who had been watching him across a room for several hours and had formed a considered opinion. "You're different than I expected," she said. "Different how, from the articles," she said simply. "The person in the articles and the person in the room aren't the same." Richard considered that. The articles were accurate, he said. The person in the room is working on being someone different. She smiled. That's the only project worth having, she said, and moved on. He took a cab home alone, sat in the back seat, and watched the city go past, in the May evening lighter and longer lit than it had been in February, the streets carrying the particular energy of a city, discovering again that warmth is possible, that the long cold period was not permanent. He thought about Victoria at the podium, about 42 students in the front rows with their whole lives ahead of them, about the way she had built something extraordinary and patient and real over decades of being underestimated by the exact people who should have been paying the closest attention. He thought about what his daughter Emma had said on the phone in February, 3 months after everything had collapsed. I looked her up online properly for the first time. She's kind of a legend, Dad. And we just had dinner with her and complained about traffic. He had been having dinner with a legend for 16 years. He had complained about traffic. The cab stopped in front of his building. He paid and got out and stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the May air, and he thought about the 17-year-old in his father's kitchen who had made a promise about the man he was going to become. That boy had been right about one thing. It mattered what you built. He had just been building the wrong thing for a very long time, had been measuring the construction with the wrong instruments, had been standing in the wrong rooms, calling himself powerful, while the actual power in his life was sitting quietly across the dinner table and choosing every day not to diminish herself to match his limited understanding of what she was. She had been patient. She had been strategic. She had been in the end exactly who she had always been. And the world, once it finally looked directly at her, had recognized it immediately. Victoria Davenport did not need his validation to be extraordinary. She never had. She had only needed him to get out of the way. And when he finally did, when he was finally removed thoroughly and precisely, and with the kind of planning that only a truly extraordinary person executes, what was revealed was not a woman diminished by years of being overlooked. What was revealed was an empire. 118 hotels, 11 countries, 12,000 employees who described her when journalists finally started asking as the most genuinely caring leader they had ever worked for. A philanthropic foundation that was changing the trajectories of hundreds of young lives. A professional reputation that had been built in silence over decades and was now finally being spoken at full volume by an industry that had always known it was dealing with someone remarkable, even when she had asked them not to say so. Richard Sterling went inside his building, took the elevator to his floor, let himself into his apartment, and stood in his bare-walled living room for a moment. He had exactly what he had earned, and she had exactly what she had built. The difference between those two things was the whole story, the only story. And Richard Sterling, standing alone in the quiet of his rented apartment on a May evening, understood it completely and without reservation for the very first time. Victoria Davenport had never needed a crown. She had simply been the queen all along.